Good morning and welcome to WITA. We are delighted to have you here. If you are a newcomer, welcome. If you've joined us before, we're pleased to have you back. We have a great event planned today with three of my favorite people in the trade community. But before we get to today's event, we want to tell you about an important new initiative which we launched this month, the Wida Academy. The mission of the Wida Academy is to make trade education and career opportunities in international trade accessible to communities in the United States and around the world, and to make the trade community itself more diverse, equitable, and inclusive. The first program of the WITA Academy will be our 2022 Intensive Trade Seminar, where career trade policy professionals from across the U.S. government, industry, and law lead sessions on how the U.S. formulates and implements its international trade policy. That event takes place over 3 days starting September 30th, and information can be found in the chat and on our website at www.wita.org. If you've attended any of our webinars over the past couple of years, you know we like to call out the names of some of those you're in community with, even if you can't see them on Zoom. So welcome today to Prudence Gordon with the Australian Centre for International Trade and Investment, Karen Bland with HP, Commissioner Amy Carpel of the U.S. International Trade Commission, and our dear friend Ambassador Carla Hills of Hills & Company, and the winner of WITA's Lifetime Achievement Award at our annual dinner a couple weeks ago. Welcome Prudence, Karen, Amy, and Carla, and welcome to all of you. If you're watching this on Zoom, you can ask questions of our panel using the Q&A tab on Zoom. We'll try to get to as many of those as we can toward the end of our session. You should have received a copy of today's event program and biographies of our speakers by email, so we'll dispense with lengthy introductions. I couldn't be more pleased to welcome today's guests, three people who are well known in the trade world but have never been together on the WITA stage, starting with my good friend Angela Ellard, the Deputy Director General of the WTO. Angela and I go way back when I was starting out as a Senate trade staffer, and Angela came to tell me why legislation I was helping move through the Senate wasn't going to work. She was right. The legislation, which became a law, didn't work, and I learned never to doubt Angela again. Angela will be joined in discussion by two good friends of WITA, Sarah Stewart, Executive Director of the Silverado Policy Accelerator, and a former Deputy Assistant USTR for Environment and Natural Resources, and Jennifer Prescott, Director for International Trade and Tax and Latin America Policy at Amazon Web Services, and the former Assistant U.S. Trade Rep for Environment and Natural Resources. I can't think of three better people to give us an update about the recently concluded Fisheries Agreement at the WTO. What are some next steps on fisheries, environmental sustainability, and multilateralism? Jennifer, take it away.
Great. Thanks so much, Ken. And it's great to see you. It's great to see you, Sarah and Angela. Great to be with you today. And of course, good morning to everybody out there listening and watching. So first of all, I just want to start out by saying congratulations to you, Angela, and to the WTO for this landmark fisheries subsidies agreement. I know that you know this and many on the phone know, but for those of you who haven't followed these negotiations closely, this agreement is literally decades in the making. Lots and lots of hard work and smart people. And so, you know, just congratulations to you. And I also just want to say congratulations to some of the U.S. team that I think might be on the line today, but special shout outs, of course, to Kelly Milton, who led the U.S. Negotiating team here, as well as, of course, to Ambassador Maria Pagan and to Ambassador Tai. Thank you for your just sustained leadership in these negotiations, in thought and in muscle over the years. So anyway, I'm so excited to have this conversation and to hear from you, Angela, how this all came together. And how you see the road ahead for implementation of this agreement, the remaining issues that will also need to be addressed, as well as the broader trade and environment agenda, which I think will get just a tremendous amount of momentum from this landmark agreement on fisheries subsidies. And so, Angela, I'm just particularly interested to hear from you and how your perspective, may have shifted when you came into the role as the deputy DG at the WTO after having worked on these issues for many, many years from your perch at Ways and Means, and how your experience helped shape the way that you worked with all the different WTO members to reach consensus on this landmark agreement. And so I'm super looking forward to hearing from you, Angela. And then, of course, Sarah and I will have some follow-up questions for you as well as the audience.
Well, thank you so much, Jennifer. And what a great pleasure it is to be here today with you all, even virtually. I've learned so much from the both of you over the years on environmental issues in particular. And you all have set such a strong foundation in terms of US policy on the issues. So thank you for that over so many years. And a special hello to Ken as well. And yes, I do remember that meeting that we had. I won't even say how many years ago, but it can be measured in decades. And maybe I might have been right. I don't know. I think people may disagree about that, but I would say one thing that Ken had, and that was the votes. So it didn't matter who was right or wrong. He definitely had the votes. So such a fascinating topic to just chew on for a while. I think that thank you, first of all, for offering congratulations, Jennifer. I think that this agreement is something that at the WTO we're quite proud of and that our members are quite proud of. And as you all know, in the WTO system, any agreement like what we were talking about, this particular negotiation has to be consensus-based. So that meant that we had to get all 164 of our members on board. And that certainly was not an easy process. To be honest, I think several weeks before, maybe even the day before the ministerial meeting began about 6 weeks ago, there were many in the press who were writing off the chance that we would have success on any issue, let alone on fish subsidies, which, as Jennifer notes, is a negotiation that had gone on for 21 years. So it is a great accomplishment that our members were able to come together. And it was really a process of give and take of many, many long hours. I've just been at the WTO for a year, a little over a year, but the many years that went on of negotiations before then were quite difficult. And in the last several months before MC12, in the last several days, in the last several hours, it was enormously heated. But members were starting to come together on some of the issues, and it was very clear that there was a pathway forward if members wanted to take it. And having ministers in Geneva in person in such a small, intimate setting as our building, I think really created a lot of momentum. So the work is not done, but we've done a lot. And so we're relishing this moment. We just did a program today in the WTO on aid for trade, focusing on fish. That was really, I think, quite eye-opening in terms of focusing on some of the problems that we're facing. We have this situation in which per year, we see about $22 billion per year of harmful government subsidies going into the fishing sector. It's just such a dramatic amount, not just in terms of the dollar value, but in terms of the perverse policy choices that it creates that lead directly to a lack of sustainability in fishing. We're now at the point where nearly 50% of fish stocks are overfished. And this number has been increasing exponentially. And it's going to get worse unless we effectively implement this agreement and take the steps that are necessary to begin to rebuild the fish stocks. It's not just a question of maintaining the status quo. It's not just a question of ending the subsidies now. We have to rebuild the fish stocks. And this is something that the agreement is aimed at doing, of course, by prohibiting IUU fishing, subsidies with respect to IUU fishing, the illegal, unregulated, unreported fishing, but also addressing fishing, also addressing subsidies that lead to overfishing. That's very important. And also addressing subsidies, prohibiting subsidies that are aimed at fishing in the unregulated high seas, which is an area, of course, which is the great unknown. And no one really knows what happens there. That's where a lot of forced labor occurs as well. So these are disciplines that are incredibly important to achieve sustainability. Now, there are several things that we still need to do. We need to enter the agreement into force. And that's it's complicated because we have 164 members and we need 2/3 of them to deposit their instruments of acceptance with the WTO. For many governments, it's a relatively easy thing to do. For others, it's a little bit more complicated. So we need to make sure that happens. And of course, we have resources available here at the WTO to help. So I know that on this call, there are a lot of the Washington-based embassies, and I just want to make a special plea to all of you to work within your governments to try to get these instruments deposited so that we can actually see the agreement enter into force. Our Director General today said that her target for doing this, and it's, I think, a shared target among so many, is to do this in less than a year, and considerably less than a year if we can, because the situation is getting worse. Now, of course, we have more work to do too in terms of future negotiations. There were some issues that we didn't quite get to, where we couldn't quite reach the consensus that we wanted to see. So we're going to be continuing our work there, and we really need to get going on that as soon as possible, because in the protocol that contains the agreement, it says that members will make recommendations to the ministerial conference for our next ministerial conference in MC13, which isn't all that far down the road. We don't have a date yet, but it could very well be at the end of 2023, the beginning of 2024, whatever the members decide. So that is something that we have to get going on. So that's the road ahead that we're facing. One other element that I would like to highlight is that this agreement in Article 7 contains an element that I think will really help us in terms of implementation and in next steps. And that is a fund that's established to help developing countries and least developed countries to meet their obligations under the agreement, and also to help them in terms of all the notification and transparency requirements that are in the agreement. So this fund we're aiming at $10 million US. We already informally have pledges for about half of that, even really before we've started. But this fund, I think, will be very important in terms of helping developing countries not only meet their obligations, but to start to undertake fisheries management systems that will help us move towards sustainability in these fish stocks. So that is something that we're quite eager to get going and is another one of these important next steps. I think you did ask one other question, Jennifer, that I want to get to, which is how my perspective shifted in moving from the Hill to the WTO. I found that it did shift in some ways, and it didn't shift in others. My practice started right out of law school in litigation, which was very, of course, scorched earth. And then when I moved to the Hill, I realized you really can't have a scorched earth approach to solving problems, because you have to build coalitions, you have to have more collaboration. I've found in moving to the WTO, a lot of that, of course, applies, but on steroids, because of our consensus-based system, where you can't even decide what you're going to have for lunch by a vote. It has to be something everyone agrees on, or at least that no one says that they will object to. So really, the skills of listening, of trying to incorporate new ideas, of trying to figure out why particular members are seeking particular outcomes, and how best we can do this is an important skill to have. And for me, in my role, of course, I'm not supposed to take sides, except the side, I guess, in support of multilateralism and reaching agreements. So my role is really more of being a facilitator. So that's a bit different from where I was in the Hill, of course, where one is very much an advocate. And in some ways, although you try to be bipartisan, sometimes it always doesn't work that way. So anyway, it's been a very interesting, fascinating transition for me. And it's just so great to see the successes of MC12 that just strengthen the institution here, and I think have built a lot of support for our work going forward, not just in fisheries management, but in some of in fisheries subsidies, but other areas as well, including more broadly on the environmental front.
Well, I'm going to jump in here and just say thank you so much, Angela, for those comments. There's so much that we have to dive into. Thank you, Ken, for hosting this. Jennifer could not be, any more sort of on point with this. Really has taken a village to get to this landmark agreement. So many people have put so much time and really rolled up their sleeves from the United States and many other countries to get to this point. And it's so exciting. It's also so exciting for the three of us to be together again, talking about, the conclusion of an agreement. And as we all know in negotiations, getting to that point is truly something that we can all celebrate. You talked a lot, Angela, about where you landed, where you're going, and I wanted to ask you a little bit about how you got there, because as we've discussed, this is a couple of decades in the making, and there's probably, if you can go back and sort of do a little history on the fisheries subsidies agreement negotiations, there's a lot to unpack there, fits and starts. I think in the last, 5 or 6 years, we've seen growing momentum, maybe from a few different reasons. The UN Sustainable Development Goals, including the ambition for a fisheries subsidies agreement. We also saw the CPTPP countries have that agreement enter into force with fisheries subsidies provisions. Of course, something near and dear to my heart is the USMCA agreement and the fisheries subsidies, commitments there. What do you think? Do you think that all of those things contributed? What really helped to take this over the finish line? And then can you talk a little bit about if the UN SDG really sort of catalyzed some ambition here, could that be used as a model for other multilateral agreements that the WTO may take on board going forward?
Yes, that's a great question, Sarah, and it's I think it's one of those things where we had a confluence of factors that came together that created this momentum. Although it was still a bit of a roller coaster, and there was really no inevitability until maybe the last hour or so, or the last 2 hours after a 48-hour stretch straight through of trying to, you all are familiar with this type of momentum from your negotiating days. So I would say there are several factors. One is that the situation concerning fish stocks is just getting so much worse, and I think it's just so incredibly obvious. When you go from 10% overfished in the 70s to maybe 25% overfished when these negotiations began, to 50% overfished now, and getting worse, that I think so many members realized that now was the moment. In so many of the debates, members were raising this issue. Even among, of course, members who subsidize, many of them were seeking to reform their subsidies, and so wanted to lock in some of the other members. Then we had developing countries who see some of the big subsidizers fishing and taking up, really diminishing the fish stocks that they should be able to fish, but don't perhaps have the ability to do so to quite an extent. So I think that was building. Then at the same time, we had in the fall of 2015, the adoption of the UN SDG goals, the Sustainable Development Goals. And one of those goals in particular, 14.6, was targeted at fish sustainability of fish stocks. And specifically, our negotiations, the WTO fisheries subsidies negotiations. So that had a near immediate effect on the negotiations, although we were still, that was still 7 years ago, 6.5 years ago. So there were new proposals that ministers made in Nairobi at that ministerial conference, including language that mirrored 14.6. There was no outcome there, but then at the next ministerial, we saw similar efforts to try to, in MC11 in Buenos Aires, to track the language of 14.6. So then we had a deadline. We had a deadline in the SDG of 2020, and we missed that deadline. And that created, I think, a lot of soul searching among the members as well. So it put a lot of pressure on them. Then we had our new Director General, who began her service at the WTO about just under 1.5 years ago, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who brought such leadership to the issue right from her first day as being something that she really wanted to see the members come together. And then we have a fabulous chair of the negotiating group on rules who led these negotiations for the last several years, Ambassador Santiago Wills from Colombia, who just was such a force during all of these negotiations. An incredible team here in the Secretariat at the WTO who have spent years on this negotiation. Clarice Morgan, who is the director of the Rules Division, who was involved in these negotiations from the very beginning. And then, of course, so many dedicated delegations here in Geneva, also in capitals. The pandemic slowed us down, but then in a way it helped us because we got used to the hybrid mode where we could very quickly bring in people from capitals just on a Zoom call or a WebEx call with interpretation, and suddenly things were quite possible. A lot of ups and downs, though, certainly no denying, but I think at the end there really was a will to get this down, to get this done. So I do think you asked whether this could be a model for other negotiations in the environmental area, and I think perhaps it can be. The SDGs are an ecosystem, and they all relate to each other. So just because this one is done, 14.6, check, that one's done. We still have more work to do on this issue, but it will also help us, I think, in terms of some of the other SDGs. So SDG 1 and 2, dealing with food security and economic livelihood. Of course, this will contribute directly to achieving those goals. But I think it's also given some members confidence we hear within the WTO that we can work on environmental issues, that there's a sense that working on something like fisheries subsidies, but some of the other issues that we're working on, like plastics pollution, that the environment is a global common good, a global public good. And the WTO, it wasn't all that long ago where there was a hesitance to bring these issues into the mix. But now I think we see something quite different, and that's definitely something that we can build on.
Great, thank you, Angela. So you mentioned, Angela, a couple of important data points that drove the negotiations in terms of, the significant decline of fish stocks, and that really, helped focus the minds of negotiators, right, on this problem that needed to be addressed. And so I wanted to ask you about actually the transparency provisions of this agreement, and how you see those as being important in tackling what has been another persistent challenge along the way, which was that we lacked a lot of data on the actual subsidies that were being provided, because many members actually lacked up-to-date subsidy notifications under the SCM agreement. And there was a lot of work, and Clarice and others were very engaged in this too at the WTO Secretariat, helping members to put together their transparency notifications. But I just love to hear from you, how you kind of see the transparency obligations helping to address that, sort of gap in data and knowledge, and also if you see those as helping implementation of the agreement moving forward too.
I think that transparency is a huge innovation in this agreement, and I would, for those in the audience who are curious, I really do encourage you to take a look at these provisions because they really are so innovative. It's one thing to prohibit particular types of subsidies. And that's, I think, oftentimes what people think of in terms of a multilateral agreement or any type of agreement. But it's such an important element of this agreement does relate to the transparency. And here is one example to follow up on Sarah's point where we built on USMCA. And the very important work that had been done there, creating that momentum, I think, for us to achieve that. And actually, I should have mentioned USMCA and CBTPP as well in terms of creating momentum for a positive outcome. It showed people that it could be done. But I think that the transparency provisions are very important because what it involves is a requirement that members notify particular types of things. So they have to notify, of course, the subsidies that they're taking. That's not particularly new in the subsidies and countervailing measures agreement that exists right now. There are notification requirements, so it's familiar. The concept is familiar to members, but obviously, what they have to notify is a bit different. It relates to subsidies that are harmful and therefore are prohibited under the agreement. So that's a very important innovation in terms of the link to sustainability. But also members are to provide information about the status of fish stocks. And this not just in a general way, but on a very specific basis in terms of individual fish stocks. This is going to be a treasure trove of information for us that will be useful in the WTO as we get ready for the next wave of negotiations. But also it helps members in understanding where the problem areas are. And it gives them an opportunity to determine, I think, even more specifically, the particular stocks that are at risk, the particular practices that are linked to that. And then also there are a lot of requirements with respect to fisheries management that are part of this notification and transparency exercise. That helps particularly developing countries to understand what's happening in their neighboring with their neighbors or with big subsidizers. And I think that is an incredibly valuable portion of this agreement as well. And of course, it is enforceable. So to the extent members fail to provide the notifications, that's something that can be addressed. Our agreement also creates a specific new committee on fisheries subsidies. So that's a forum to discuss these notifications as well. Now, for a lot of developing country and least developed country members, they are saying, and understandably, that it's difficult for them to meet some of these obligations right away, some of these notifications right away. And one of the important aspects of the fund that's established in Article 7, the Fish Trust Fund, is to help developing countries and LDCs meet these notification requirements, all based on the premise that information is power and will give us more tools to be able to focus the negotiations coming forward and also to address the particular problems of sustainability that we have now.
These are such important points, and I'm so glad that you were able to reach consensus with all the WTO members on the transparency provisions, because as you say, even though they're not necessarily the prohibitions, it is so difficult for some countries to be able to think about how they're going to collect the information that's needed and to put it forward. So having something that holds everyone's feet to the fire, I think, is important. And at the end, you mentioned the sort of relationship of the transparency provisions to the fish fund, which I also think is great, because sometimes the lack of transparency is strategic, but many times it's a lack of capacity. And so having the ability for the fish fund to, provide that type of assistance is great. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more in depth about the fish fund. So beyond some of the transparency pieces, where do you see the bulk of the fund being targeted? And do you see this as, and how do you think that you'll prioritize certain projects?
Well, there are just so many problems to tackle where the fund, I think, will be of tremendous value. And I think one of the important features of the fund is that it is a partnership. This is a fund that we are creating together with donor members, so various WTO members who see the fund as serving a very important purpose in ensuring compliance and in also building on the notifications and transparency that we've been talking about, to give confidence to developing country members that we realize they're going to need some help in terms of technical assistance and capacity building. It's kind of having donors put their money where their mouth is, that they will provide this type of helping hand. But it's not just donor members. It's also donor international organizations that we're partnering with. We just did the Aid for Trade session that I just described, in which we had the OECD, the World Bank, the FAO, who are all important partners in this effort with us. They already, and many WTO members bilaterally, already contribute huge amounts, billions of dollars, with respect to fisheries and fisheries subsidies, with respect to fisheries sustainability. So we want to use the fund to leverage that type of activity, but not duplicate it. So we know what our strengths are here in the WTO, and we also know what the strengths are of other multilateral organizations. So bringing this together is important. We have a lot of expertise here in the WTO in terms of the subsidies issues, and in terms of the definition of subsidies and whether something is a prohibited subsidy or not in the context of the Fisheries Agreement. So we can bring that knowledge to bear, but we can also, and through the fund will be, which will be housed at the WTO, we'll be working with other partners like the FAO, which is really expert in the question of fisheries management. We are not here in the WTO a fisheries management organization. We can't pretend to be, but the FAO can help in that regard. So it's a great opportunity to bring all of these strengths together in one place. And it will take a little bit of time and effort, of course, to set up the fund, but we're on a fast track and are working with our members to be able to get that established as soon as possible. But I do want to emphasize that although the fund is not going to be established tomorrow, it is on a fast track. But as members, particularly developing country, least developed members, are looking to deposit their instruments of acceptance, we do have other resources within the WTO for capacity building and technical assistance that we can use to help bring information to developing countries about what they need to do to deposit those instruments and to start their compliance process.
Thanks, Angela. And since we're kind of moving along this theme, talking about implementation, talking about the fund and how it can help members, along the implementation path, how do you see technology potentially helping on this issue more broadly, helping with members' implementation? I know there are several NGOs, that have been kind of working in that technology space and thinking about these issues, but how do you see that, Angela?
Well, I think technology is an incredibly important aspect of this because the ocean is a huge place, and knowing what's happening with respect to particular fish stocks really requires a lot of technology, and engaging in a sustainable fisheries management policy also requires a tremendous amount of technology. So whether it is having boats equipped with technology to fish sustainably, or whether it's technology that's needed for data collection, two different types of technology, but both of them very much supported through this effort, particularly in the fund in certain aspects, but also our partnerships with other efforts, either bilaterally, either bilaterally with other members, or through work that the World Bank does, which really has much more of an ability, I think, to help developing countries in getting some of the technological equipment that they need. That's not something we can do directly in the WTO. It's not our mission, it's not our mandate. We're not big enough to do that. But our partnerships with these other multilateral organizations, I think, really creates an opportunity. And now that we have concluded this agreement, those international organizations have really stood up and take notice. It was one of my greatest, I think, professional thrills to go to the Ocean Conference in Lisbon a few weeks ago, right after MC12 and after we concluded the agreement. And so many heads of state there, so many international organizations at the most senior level, of course, the UN running the show, how much excitement there was, because after all, this is the first SDG goal that has been met. So I think this means that we will have tremendous opportunities to build on what we've done and to be able to leverage this agreement into areas like a seriousness of purpose about using technology and having some of these international organizations working with us to deploy it.
This is one of the benefits of a modern agreement. So we've talked a lot about the great milestones that have been achieved, and I know that, you know, at least a few of the audience questions have asked about, you know, there are some tougher issues that are remaining. Could you touch on that, Angela, and, you know, what the next steps will be there? And then maybe if you're able, sort of also touch on the sunset provisions. And do you see these provisions as offering, you know, a way to hold countries' feet to the fire? Do you think it will scare them off? How do you see those operating?
I think that there is still a lot of work to be done. The agreement is a very significant agreement for what it accomplishes, which I think is a huge amount. We obviously wanted more. I think, you know, particularly relating, there are provisions that prohibit subsidies for stocks that are overfished, but we really want to delve into the capacity issue, overcapacity, for example, with respect to overfishing, and the relationship. That has proven to be a difficult issue. We did make a tremendous amount of progress in the texts that have been circulated over the last year on this issue. This is an issue, though, that's complicated because you want to establish hard obligations, but at the same time, you want to provide an opportunity for subsidization to rebuild stocks, so for purposes of sustainability. So that's a very important part of this exercise as well. And then you also have the question of special and differential treatment for developing countries, and how these two elements of provisions that go even further, as well as SNDG, how the two of them intersect. And that's ultimately where we could not reach agreement. Although over the last several months, I think we made a tremendous amount of progress. So now we have, in terms of these particular issues, we have a roadmap ahead, in a sense, because we have these texts that had been circulated by the chair. And the agreement specifically talks about the protocol to the agreement talks about using these texts as a basis for moving forward. Ultimately, it's a member decision as to how they want to proceed. And I know our chair is already starting to engage with members to see how we go about doing this, so that we can bring more of this to light. Now, one of the aspects of this agreement that's designed to create an incentive to reaching agreement on these issues relates to the fact that 4 years after entry into force, the agreement will expire. That sounds like a crazy thing. Here we've just gone off and negotiated this agreement, this terrific agreement, and it's going to expire in not that very long. But the idea is that it expires in a way that what it really is doing is it's creating an action forcing event. I don't think anyone wants this agreement to expire. I've talked to so many delegations since MC12, during MC12, of course, at the very end of MC12, such tremendous excitement. And remember, again, this is a consensus agreement. So it's 164 members who supported this agreement. They're not going to want to see us move backwards and all of a sudden allow subsidies in IUU fishing, for example. So this creates a real incentive, I think, for members to move forward. And we have some time to do that, not a whole lot of time. There is an intermediate deadline in which by MC13, the members are supposed to present their recommendations about how to, what these disciplines might be, what these new disciplines might be. So really time is of the essence. So we have this built-in mechanism basically for continuing the work and being able to expand beyond what we've done so far. Did I answer all of your question? I wasn't sure if there was a second part.
No, you certainly did. And
Okay.
I think we have a number of audience questions. So Ken's going to come back on, and I just want to say that hearing your insights, Angela, on how we got here, where we're going, is invaluable. I hope that the audience has a lot of really constructive takeaways, reviews this agreement, participates to the extent possible, because there's a lot of work to be done and really exciting collaborative work. So with that, thank you so much. And
Don't go anywhere. Stay on.
No, well, I'm not leaving, but I probably won't come back on. So turning.
All right. Well, first of all, thanks.
You all have so much experience in these negotiations. You should help me answer the questions.
I think if we could pull in probably about a third to half of our audience, they have experience in some parts of these negotiations, or certainly with WTO negotiations overall. And before we go any further, by the way, Angela, your memory is legendary apparently, because when you were remembering about our first encounter, those are the exact words I said to you.
Yes.
A while ago is, you may be right, but I have the votes. So that is a case. I wondered whether or not you remembered any of that meeting when we first met. That was exactly the words I said to you. We have some interesting questions that have come in. Just follow up on a lot of the things we've talked about, and maybe just go a little more specifically. I think pulling a couple of them together, and they just want to know, what is the precedent that this agreement means for further negotiations on environmental related issues? We can get into some other stuff elsewhere, but about EGA revival, about what it may mean. Is there any activity for the WTO to take on carbon border adjustments? Do you see any is the door opening for some more of these discussions on any of these issues, and some of the fisheries related issues that weren't in this agreement that took so long to reach? Will there be any momentum to try to address some of those?
I think that this agreement, successfully concluding this agreement, has given members confidence, first of all, in the multilateral system and in consensus-based decision-making. That is a huge step, I think, for members, because I think people were starting to feel a little vulnerable about whether the WTO could do this. So this type of agreement, I think, is a huge shot in the arm, regardless of the subject matter, that this is a viable forum for addressing particular issues. Now, as to the specific question about environmental negotiations and whether it creates some momentum for that, I think it absolutely does. It wasn't all that long ago when issues like the environment were always kept separate from trade agreements. And I think in this case, members realize that First of all, the environment is a global common good that has trade elements to it. So it's an economic issue, of course. It has to do with the livelihood of hundreds of millions, nutrition as well. It is an important issue from that economic perspective. And it's an important issue for environmental health and sustainability. So I think in that way, it's really given members confidence that perhaps we can tackle some other issues that may not be subsidy issues in quite the same way, but do have some common elements. So you mentioned, for example, environmental goods. I would say environmental goods and services. Maybe there is an opportunity to revive these negotiations. I think as we're sweltering here in Geneva. Western Europe has been in a heat wave for the last 3 weeks. We're not air conditioned. It's not. This is such this is the Washington climate that is, and you all are suffering too in Washington. But it's the Washington climate that has moved here. I think as a result, there's an increasing awareness about the huge challenges of climate change, and that trade can be part of the solution here. Sometimes people think of trade as being as contributing to the problems of climate change. And maybe it has in some elements, but I think at the same time, it also provides the opportunity for solutions. So eliminating tariffs on products that for green technology creates an opportunity for countries to purchase green technology for much lower prices. It allows for more trade in these types of products, reducing barriers to services in the environmental area, clean services. That's another aspect as well. Digital trade has a lot of clean aspects to it as well. We've been working here on plastics trade, circular economy issues. And these are issues where we're finding that more and more members are participating in these initiatives. We have 89 members, and more than half of our developing and LDC members participate in at least one of these initiatives, representing about 85% of global trade and 75% of annual trade in plastics. So I think that's an area. And then you mentioned carbon pricing, and that's an area where I know the Director General and I and our teams would certainly very much like to see the WTO more involved. It's different members have different policies back home when it comes to carbon, what to do about carbon, and what kind, whether we have a border adjustment system or a regulatory system. But I think that what we are seeing is the need for some type of global pricing mechanism, whether it's industry specific or across the board, so that governments can weigh policy, can make policy choices, and stakeholders know what the value of those choices are. So that's an area where I think the WTO can contribute, and I think the fisheries negotiations have put us on the map in terms of talking about environmental issues.
And I think there's a lot of there's been a lot of attention paid on these issues in recent months and years. I know the work of a lot of the people, as I was saying, on this Zoom session. And Angela, I know you're not here anymore in DC, but there's been a lot of legislative changes or progress made just in the last 48 hours on several issues that kind of reset baseline, I think, in the US, assuming these get to the president's desk for signature, between the semiconductor bill and the new subsidies that are going to be going into that sector. If this agreement with Senator Manchin fully comes together over the next today and the next few days, a lot more money spent on the U.S. on clean technologies. How do you think that's going to be perceived in Geneva? This isn't the only place, of course, where these issues have impact, obviously, but do you see this setting helping further that momentum potentially? I know it's new news. I don't even know, some of it happened while you were probably asleep last night when it hit the news here in the US. But do you think that helps set some new baseline and maybe create further momentum for additional discussions on some of these issues?
Well, sadly, I wasn't sleeping when the news came through. So, of course, very much awaiting the details to see how it comes together and how it survives the bird bath process, which is a concept I haven't thought about in a year. I haven't thought of, used to be so much part of my life. Now to think again about the bird bath. But it is, I think people are going to be very interested to see what the details are. I think that in terms of climate change, like I said, there is a real imperative to taking action. Different governments take different types of action, and it sometimes has effects on others. Sometimes it doesn't. So I think it's pretty safe to say there will be a lot of close examination by our members here in Geneva about what the new, assuming this does become law, what it does and what its implications are.
Well, thanks, Angela. And just for our international audience or people who aren't familiar with Washington processes, a bird bath is making sure that this particular legislation is written in just such a way that the rules in the U.S. Senate allow it to proceed under these special rules that only require 50 votes. It requires a lot of detail, very new specific things about revenue measures, but it's a legislative procedure issue that has to be determined by a person called the parliamentarian in the Senate to determine that the provisions in the agreement that are reached meet the rules of the Senate for a 50-vote threshold. So anyway, sorry about all that.
Looking like a true Senate guy. But let me just assure the audience, if you're going to a cocktail party tonight, if you just throw out, I wonder if the New Deal will survive the bird bath, I think people will think you're very smart.
Certainly, it has nothing to do with flying creatures that enter a bird bath. It was named for Senator Robert Seabird of West Virginia, I believe, who was very stickler for Senate rules and procedures. Anyway, with that, Angela, thank you so very much. Jennifer, Sarah, we are incredibly grateful to both of you as well, all of you who joined us today. Thank you. Thanks, Angela, again for your time. Stay cool. I'm told that heat pumps work potentially for cooling. Might be a place to invest in Geneva for cooling some of those older buildings there. Anyway, thank you so much. Please take care of yourself and everyone around you all. Safe travels for those of you who will be traveling this summer. And thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you all very much. Wonderful to see you.
Nice to see you.